All right, welcome everyone. My name is Brett, and this is another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. Our guest today is recent Voices with Vervaeke guest Jacob Kishere. Thank you for being here, Jacob.
Really nice to be here, Brett.
So, can you tell us a bit about yourself? We when we saw you in your Voices with Vervaeke, you were in Greece. I understand you're in Germany now, but tell us a bit about the journey that led you through uh, to setting up your channel and to your discussion with John, and basically to being here today.
Yeah, that'd be great, Brett. It's been a long one, I have to say. I guess the launch of SenseBase, which has kind of been my project, started in March this year, but the inquiry that kind of gave birth to it has been going on for the past 4 or 5 years, I guess, for me. Um, Started out generally, I guess, about 5 or 6 years ago. I placed myself in the kind of new atheist community sphere, and I kind of was drawn into that sort of alternative discourse. And then as I went through university, became exposed to um, Islamic political activism at my own university in East London. I became really curious about this. And I started sort of inquiring into a nexus of things about Islam and the West, the nature of jihadism. And it really developed into a kind of meta-modern approach to questions around Islam. So as I was undergoing that, and I don't want to sort of drag the introduction on too long, but um, as I was going through that inquiry, I was recognizing the breakdown of sense making sort of all the way up from my experience as a student, and then sort of hanging around with think tanks in London, foreign policy think tanks, and then doing my postgraduate study. I started to look at the intellectual dark web in the very early days and think this might be a place where the conversation can happen at the level that I'm sort of idiosyncratically having it with myself. And so that's been, evolving for the past 3 years. And then in the past year with the kind of rebirth of Dialogos, that's been a real source of my focus, and it's all been in interaction with my personal development and kind of life path up to this point, I guess.
So you mentioned your YouTube channel. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So SenseBase has a kind of ambiguous title that largely is sort of, it's my own inquiry extended out into the world. I guess I had the experience that a lot of people watching John and Guy Sangstock and Jordan Hall have, of really closely following the conversation to the extent that you feel like you're sort of the fourth wall, and you're having the conversation and the dialectic is continuing in your head. Um, and I suppose the meaning crisis was something that I felt I was experiencing personally over the last few years, and really working through some difficult relationships and my own sort of working through my own trauma and so forth. So my relationship to Dialogos has been one in which it's kind of very personally spoken to me at times when nothing else in the culture really was doing it. And so, yeah, it's my ongoing inquiry. It's kind of an experimentation into what sort of embodied presence and coming into not knowing, kind of taking a slower pace, not rushing the discourse, and really seeing where we can go with that, and really trying to connect on a personal level with whoever it is I'm speaking with. Yeah.
And you've talked to a lot of the same people that we've had on here, like Guy Senstock, and you said, Jordan Hall, and of course John Vervaeke. Uh, how did so are you basically who are you reaching out to on your podcast? You seem to have a, is it sort of the game B sense making wisdom crowd, or
Yeah, it's kind of following different branches, and my approach to choosing who I speak to next is a very sort of intuitive one. So I don't really have a long term plan. Usually, after each conversation, I'm going through a process of, you know, 2 or 3, 4 weeks of living my life, and during that time, I'm kind of playing with what I'm engaging with and what feels most salient in the conversation, and then reaching out. So yeah, I've been talking to John and Guy. I've spoken to Jordan privately. Um, just people that I meet sort of in my life that are interesting. Um, Mina Salami, who's actually a kind of game B-ish feminist thinker. Well, yeah, I guess the game B dialogo space has been kind of where I've been hanging out a lot.
and and you describe briefly to John that you 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 started off as a Christian, and a fairly observant Christian, as I understand it. Then you say you went atheist, then agnostic, and then you say you took a completely different route to spirituality and the relationship to mystery and contemplative practice without reference to Christianity or Christ. Can you tell us a bit
Hmm.
about that journey, and what does, I tend to call it secular spirituality, I guess. What does that mean to you?
Hmm. Just thinking about whether to approach it from chronology or where I am now, but I guess it was an observant Christian context, but it was not an orthodox Christian context. It was kind of a hippy dippy Christian rock, sing along, evangelical kind of thing. And my father was a minister of that community, so I kind of grew up seeing him speaking to, sort of speaking off the cuff to groups of people, and seeing people praying and weeping in prayer. I didn't really see much sort of speaking in tongues and rolling around on the floor, but I understand, some of that stuff has gone on as well. So I think I found some solace in rationalism and secularism, um, which was also kind of a necessary distancing from my own past. So as I went through the process, I began to kind of map my relationship to the Christianity that I'd inherited from my father with the relationship that we have in modernity to Christianity as an inheritance. So I've kind of seen myself go through that phase of um, sort of rejection and distancing, and then finding my own way. And we can talk about sort of what provoked that. But um, in kind of finding my own way outside of that context, I then felt sort of secure enough to reapproach and reconsider, um, and sort of get a more nuanced view on what was the value and what was the shortcomings, and how are we still kind of acting out the sort of Christian deep consciousness in the Western world through all of our political and ideological movements.
So did you go like the new atheist, anti-theist route at first, and then sort of move away from that? Is that what you're talking about?
I was an admirer of thinkers like Christopher Hitchens. Sam Harris had a big influence on me, Douglas Murray, and I was following a secular Muslim called Majid Nawaz for a while. whilst I was a university student. Um, but Sam Harris is an interesting one because kind of starting out as a secular rationalist, I began to see the way in which he was backdooring psychedelics and Buddhism into the new atheist movement. Um, and I personally found his like being able to show up as a rational and respectable thinker and still talk about these topics was important for me. Um, but it continued to taper off from there. Um, and I began to see the way in which a lot of these guys didn't feel like they were evolving continuously, like they existed within a certain cultural milieu that they didn't step out of, even at the level of kind of what kind of experiences and contexts they're putting themselves in. Um, so I wanted to go deeper. Um, and I felt moving from the sort of political analytical layer to sort of the philosophical, mythical, metaphysical layer was a big part of that. My own experiences with psychedelics um, were really important catalysts of my thinking about everything, really. And through through those catalysts, I began to experiment a lot more with meditation, yoga. My relationship to nature developed substantially, um, and recently the kind of sense space inquiry has been I've been sort of working on this idea of what it means to be a trans paradigmatic thinker and really experimenting with a lot of different practices and forms of expression and putting myself in lots of different sort of contexts and flavors um, in order to kind of increase my ability to be fluid and be a not knowing and maintain that sort of attention to whomever I'm speaking with.
So it sounds like you're doing all this deliberately. First, is this related to your degree? What did you study?
I studied history for my undergraduate, um, just because I loved it in school and I had a really good school teacher called Mr. Adams. There's actually a guy from the Discord server, Perry, who I think is here, who went to my high school, and
Yeah.
we were in class together. Oh, hello, Perry.
Oh, great.
Good to see you, man.
Hello, Jacob.
This is awesome. It's never happened before. So yeah, Perry, you probably remember Mr. Adams. He was very energetic, and I ended up going to the same university as him. I think Perry was going to jump on the mic. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was
feel
just going
free.
to I was just going to throw in the fact that one time I seem to remember he just dropped down and did push-ups in front of the class.
Yeah, I had forgotten that one, but yeah. So I did history, and then I was kind of going from a white, sort of lower middle class suburban small town in south coast of England to Myland in East London, which is like it's been like the historic arrival place of immigrants in London for like hundreds of years. And so it's just this crazy mixture of like sort of disaffected Cockney East Londoners and like Bangladeshis who came here in like the 70s and 80s, and then like university students, and now like in the last 5 years, like tons of like Chinese international students. So it was kind of a crazy place, and I started making friends with number of I joined the atheist secular student society my first year. I found it populated with guys who are like ex-Muslims and secular Muslims coming from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds, and it was just such a like mind-blowing thing to have these conversations with them and have them kind of talk to me very openly about the dynamics within the Islamic communities in the UK. So then I was doing that, and I was kind of tending my classes towards a lot of stuff about Islam. I studied the history of terrorism. I studied medieval Islam and various things in between. And then for my master's, I did terrorism and security studies, which, was the only sort of institutional context in which I could pursue my broader interest in these questions around Islam. It wasn't that I was so pointedly focused on the terrorism. That for me was more like a kind of symptom or sort of one outcome of a really complex interaction.
So the and are you hinting that the terrorism is sort of linked to the meaning crisis, writ large? Is that what you were sort of getting at, or?
I think what I found when I sort of delved into the breakdown of conversation and sense making for our societies on the question of radicalization and jihadism, that it became necessary for me over the course of the years in writing my dissertation to actually step outside of Western modernity in order to actually understand what was going on, because there was so much of a kind of outward blindness in sort of late modernity towards anything that wasn't of itself. And so I continually was rubbing up against this incapacity to understand that Islamic civilizational history had occurred in a very sort of insulated and separate context to Christendom, with very little dialogue occurring between the two for many hundreds of years. My research kind of inquired into questions about sense of civilizational success and supremacism within Islamic consciousness. So looking back at the sort of golden ages of the 800s and 900s, all the way through to the Ottoman Empire, there's a sense, if you're born into a Muslim context, very often, that you are born into a great and mighty sort of religion / civilization. And so there's a kind of real sharp dissonance between this inheritance and the kind of clash of the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic world with Western modernity, which it fell behind. And so you kind of have a deep code, I guess you could say, of the historical consciousness of people from Islamic contexts existing in modern day Paris or modern day Germany, which is very, very different and has a very different root structure to, people from a European context or a Chinese context or anything else.
And not to get too down the political road, but where do you see it going?
Well, that would depend where you want to go with what's it in this context.
Like this clash between, I guess, the old Islamic world and the Western world, and and a lot of the, I guess, tensions that have arisen in recent years.
I would expect that sort of jihadist insurgency in Western countries in various forms is going to be ongoing for a long time. many more decades or even centuries, depending on what we do. I would also expect a number of conflicts, which we see as kind of ancient history, like the conflict between the Greeks and the Turks, which was ended 100 years ago, is still very much deeply embedded, like in the soil of those two countries, and the memory is very strong. So, if we saw more breakdown and more instability, I could see those kinds of deeper historical narratives flaring up. But in terms of us properly understanding and resolving it, it has to be a real comprehensive response in the Western context, which actually integrates not only the Christian inheritance, but I think the inheritance of other world religions and wisdom traditions and science. Some kind of the question of the issue of Islam I see as entirely embedded in relationship to what we might call the meta crisis or the meaning crisis. So its resolution can only occur at the level of these kinds of great phase shifting evolution in how we communicate, quality of our communication, our relationships, level of sovereignty that individuals are holding within those, and that kind of stacking all the way up to how we organize collectively.
And I think you were.
And only
Oh,
then,
yeah, go ahead.
only then, I believe, will it be possible. I think a lot of people here are familiar with Game B, Game A kind of language. So I think that's, you can consider that Islamic civilization, and the Chinese Communist Party, and many other things are all playing a kind of Game A rivalrous dynamic out. So I would expect this to continue to play out unless some sort of Game B approach was to develop in the West in such a way that it was kind of like a white blood cell around. It wouldn't require a rivalrous conflict with Islam or other ideological systems. It would kind of integrate and transcend. Is incredibly difficult to do because you're dealing with something which is deeply emotionally embedded and not at all well understood by people outside of Islamic context.
And I think you were touching on what you called in your talk with John the landscape of trauma, which I'd like to come back to. But first, we have a few questions. So, Mark, you've got a question for Jacob.
Hey, Jacob. I enjoyed your talk with John, and I find it interesting what you're saying here. I would call it 4 different threads, but that you're tying together, and I'm not necessarily sure I agree with tying them together, but be that as it may, we're all kind of stuck with those 4 threads, so they're tied together in some fashion. And the aspect that you sort of called out that resonated with me the most, question-wise, was this implication that modernity, in particular, is rejects things that don't fit into whatever its model is, we'll say. And I was thinking about that in terms of sense making and historical context, right? Because you studied at least a little bit of history, right? And it seems to me that, and I think John does go through this to some extent in the Meaning Crisis series, that there are other points in history where we've lost sense making. And so he points to domicide, right, in a particular instance of domicide in history, we'll say, and um, I don't see like we got out of those things, right, without, at least I think, without catastrophic sort of results, and so I'm wondering if it's
Remind me the dom and domicide.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Would you remind me the dom? What is the dom representing in domicide?
Yeah, loss of home, right.
Hmm.
Right. So Alexander the Great, right? Then nobody knows where they live anymore, basically, even though they have freedom of movement, but the culture's changing sort of underneath them, I think is the general feel of it. Although I admit I don't have a really good handle on John's idea of domicide, or at least not as good as I'd like. So that loss of home, that ungrounding or something, I guess we could call it, that's definitely uh, wrapped up in all this. And there's definitely a sense making problem there. And I don't know if the lack of sense making comes first, or the domicide causes it, or it's sort of hard to untangle that. But in terms of this implication that the system that you're in, we'll call it modernity, although I might have arguments with that. Um, not allowing you to engage with these other things. I'm wondering what that relationship is in terms of sense making. So, is your implication that because modernity has a limited way of sense making, and it necessarily has to run into other cultures, like the Muslims they're here, right? They exist. We can't not run into them, or is it more around um, we've lost the sense making within the modernity container, right? And we have this other problem. And so we really have sort of two problems: an external threat and an internal threat. So I just wanted to get I just wanted to get your sense of that and how you thought of that, and allow you to sort of riff off those ideas and see if there's something more there or whatnot. So
Jump in, Brett.
No, yeah, go ahead.
Also, domicide feels very, very salient to me. I actually did not remember what the word means, but as you defined it, I like this is totally congruent with my actual life experience of the last several years. Like many sort of people who've come of age in the last few decades, there's a leaving of home to move to an urban environment. So there's an initial decontextualization. Everybody goes through, or a lot of people go through. I've been in a place in my life where I, sort of had my entire future plans, sort of the academic think tanky track that I was on, just run into walls. All of the ideas that I was developing were not being understood or seen by any of the context that I thought were the place where I could do what I wanted to do, and have the conversation at the level I wanted to have. So I got to the end of my master's program feeling completely disillusioned after having done the best piece of research I'd ever done. And I was also in a spot where I was in a pretty emotionally toxic dynamic in a living situation with the partner. So a lot of things in my life came to a head around the same time, about a year ago, and I was literally in a state of domicide. Had this kind of fixed vision for my future. I wanted to take this research track. I wanted to move out to San Diego where my sister lives, and I found my sense of security in the present to some extent in vision of the future. So letting go of that was a big thing for me. It's in that context that I completely stepped back, and actually sort of arrested the momentum of my life, which up until a certain age, probably from my early teens, had been sort of very narrowly projected towards the future, and this was actually a part of my emotional makeup as well. I was, emotionally limited and cut off in certain ways as well. So when you talk about modernity and sense making, I'm always wanting to bring it back to people and the actual context that we're walking around in, because that's how we experience modernity. If we're not working at the level of concept and we're trying to actually get a feel for what it is we're experiencing in reality, it's walking around on the street, sitting on public transport, and really just being emotionally and sort of giving a full attention to what's going on, getting a feeling, getting a feeling when you're looking at architecture and the kinds of structures that we build. All of these things are what informs my sense of, modernity, or the place we find ourselves in right now. So the meaning crisis feels very kind of tangible and present. If you're going through a period of your life where you're actually in confrontation with tragedy, the world that we're in today is one that makes that very difficult. Like, if you are suffering, or you're going through mental health issues, or you're going through difficulty of any kind, trauma work, whatever it is, that's when you drop into a very naked state of sensitivity to modernity. You experience the oscillation in meaning as you're walking around on the streets. There's a kind of titanic struggle going on between them, it feels to me. I kind of meandered a little bit there, Mark, but maybe you could kind of jam back with me and...
Yeah. So that, like, again, you talked about in my mind, two different things. Maybe my mind is not right, because that happens all the time. Anybody on the Discord will tell you. So this idea that modernity is bumping up against things that don't fit in its frame, right? And then this separate idea that you sort of went into detail on no, there's a problem within the modernity container of sense making. And so it looks like you're pointing to two different types of sense making. And, insofar as you've, gone into, I think some pretty good detail on your private sense making within the container of modernity, that might be an adequate answer. I'm just trying to get your thoughts, centered more around that, potentially that contrast, and maybe maybe that's a doomed experiment or something too, which is fine. I actually, yeah, I'm and I'm certainly not necessarily agreeing with you, but I see where you're coming from with the mental health and the domicide, and I very much feel like that's something to do with it. But I don't think anyone's gotten to the core of, like, what meaning crisis means, sort of from the bottom up, right, from the personal out, and whether or not, because there's this argument, like the game A, game B guys sort of seem to argue, well, no, it's because we're stuck in a bad game, right? It's like we just need to change the game. But I tend to think, no, it's because we're broken and we're projecting outwards, right? And then that outwards projection within the container is the result of that is the sense making problem, we'll say. And then there's a separate problem around modernity bumping up against things that, like, that had their glorious past, right? And they want it back. And yeah, what do we do about that? How do we understand that? And how do we interface with that? So yeah, if you want to riff a little more on that difference, or try to get more to the bottom of the meaning crisis, hey, if you get to the bottom of the meaning crisis, that'd be great too.
Yeah, I think the sense that it's this kind of contrast between the game A, game B, conceptual, phase shifty, sense makey language space, and then the meaning crisis almost feels a bit more fungible, more universal. My sense is that the manifestation of the shift from game A to game B, which is a temporary conceptual linguistic container or story that we've developed that's sort of useful for bridging us at this particular moment, will evolve, and its actual manifestation will be something coming out of us personally, growing up in the tangibility of our personal lives, well-being, and the quality of our conversations. I guess I think I'll leave it at that.
No, that's great. I like that. I tend to think of game A, game B as top-down, authoritarian, like we're gonna do, and then right. I tend to think of the meaning crisis as sort of the Peterson idea, right? It's if we all just cleaned our rooms, everything would get better at that level, right? And it takes time, obviously, but like it really is that bottom up sort of sense. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. It's very very helpful to see where you're coming from, because you have this broad interaction with all of these thoughts and ideas that I quite honestly just dismiss out of hand many times. And I'll defend that to my death, but maybe it's nice to hear what other people are actually, how they're fitting it in with, say, the meaning crisis and John's thinking, etc. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Just tack on at the end that perhaps that sort of dualism between the top down and the bottom up is somehow part of the problem, that the articulation of it is going to sort of be moving fluidly between we have another question up, Brett?
Yeah, Veloskin, you're up next.
Hey, Jacob. So
Okay.
you've brought up metamodernism a couple of times, and so far that term has been a bit of an enigma to me. Except, like, the only information I've heard of it is it's a synthesis of modernism and postmodernism. So I was just going to ask, what's your understanding of what metamodernism is, or metamodernist approaches?
Good question, Perry. Admittedly, it's not the area of emergent conversation that I've engaged with the most. Like, I haven't really plugged into Alexander Bard, and there's a couple of like Swedish, and there's another guy whose name I can't recollect, but I've been only touching on metamodernism recently through engaging with Zach Stein's work. My sense is it's something of an integral spirit. It is a kind of integral attempt to relate together, transcend, and include modernity and postmodernity and aspects of pre-modernity, and I would say also dropping all the way back to the sort of indigenous, shamanistic, Dunbar number size kind of very early communities. So it's kind of a multi-stack approach that's drawing on like deep history, ancient history, modernity, post-modernity, and trying to articulate it's trying to articulate a new narrative or a meta narrative that will include and be above all of these things and be responding to our context. However, whilst I do think it's useful, I'm currently sort of dwelling on the question of something that John and Jordan and Paul van der Klee have been talking about, which is this balancing of narrative versus experience, or for John, it's dialectic. I would say part of my dialectic towards metamodernism is, yes, it's a good placeholder, but the dialogical, conversational nature of reality is maybe a more primary understanding. So there may be part of like the game A to game B move might actually be the move away from narrative as like a primary foundation and into narrative being a kind of one of many different tools and palettes that we kind of playfully work with, that it's not the kind of underpinning of the way of being for the individuals who are part of it.
Nice. There's been a bit of talk on here that dialogos would be the narrative, like an unending narrative. But yeah.
Like a kind of embodied, I think John was calling it like an embodied expression of the logos. So yeah, it's feeling more resonant for me right now, definitely.
So what do you mean by dialogical nature of reality?
Absolutely, Brett. I'm just going to pause a little bit before I attempt to unfold that one. I guess with a more sort of Buddhistic meditation-y flavor, we might say that the breath is quite a fundamental aspect of reality that we carry with us beginning to end, and is in a kind of constant dialogue of inhalation and exhalation. Bodies as kind of chemical organisms constantly in dialogue and interaction with the environment. Constantly re-interacting and dialoguing with our narrative about what our lives mean and what's going on, where we come from, who we are, our most meaningful relationships with our partners and with our family members be understood as a kind of dialogue over time. I mean, what is it? Is there anything that kind of shines out of that for you, Brett?
Well, it sounds like you're taking a very broad definition of dialogue there. So not just two people exchanging thoughts and words, but systems interacting with one another. Is that?
Taking it away from just the level of conversation and kind of understanding it as a principle, a process of change or interaction that's going on sort of up and down the stack, left, right, forwards, backwards. Our experience of reality in the moment is actually a kind of co-arising creation of the interaction between us and our dispositions and our current state, and our past traumas and what we're attracted to and so forth, and the world as it's appearing before us. So it's coming from an understanding of the world as not quite objective, but something which is manifest in relationship to our state and our set and setting, I guess.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. So I heard really only three things there, interestingly. I heard being, right? I heard connectedness, which is John's short form definition for religio, and I heard participation. And I agree with all of that. But that's what I heard you define dialogical nature of reality as. And so that would make dialogos something like the participatory interaction between the things that are connected to you, or the things that you want to be connected to, or something along those lines. So I just wanted to pipe in with that because I see where you're going, I think.
And to kind of riff on that, I would say that we talk about what's in relationship to you or me. What we're calling me is itself constituted of an ongoing dialogue as well. I'm not a static thing. You're not a static thing. You are in a way the kind of logos of the dialogos of your kind of internal psychological conversation and your body's conversation with, what you're doing nutritionally, what drugs you're taking and not taking, and who you're around, because our nervous systems and our psyches are kind of very deeply interconnected with who we're around as well. So there's a kind of blurring of all of those boundaries, and dialogos can be the embodied way of understanding it. It's a kind of intuitive sense or a poetic sense rather than carrying at the kind of conceptual clarity of modernity, even of Abrahamic religions in some sense, although they all contain their own sort of mystical elements.
Manuel, you have a question.
So, I heard you in your talk with Vervaeke talk about the Greek Orthodox tradition and your re-exploration of that aspect of Christianity, and I was wondering whether you picked up any psychotechnologies that are valuable, and then if they are valuable, how could they be translated to be accessible for a modern person?
Would that be from the Orthodox specifically, or from Christianity as a whole, or?
Well, whatever. If you have a good example, I'll take any example.
Okay. Hi, by the way. Thank you for your question. So it was a re-engagement with Christianity for me, but it was my first engagement with Greek Orthodox. I have no real relationship to that prior to stepping into Orthodox churches in Greece. So it's been a kind of experiment in going into a religious context that is not my own. So there's a kind of unusualness to it. You kind of get to see all of the same symbols that you're familiar with, but through a different contextual lens. As I kind of said with John, the practice of the Greeks, as far as I could tell, was very rigid and constrained, and largely based on the kind of the paying of prayers to icons. And so people sort of shuffle into the room and go up to the icon and kiss it and sort of quietly say their prayer, and then they leave. But I think there could be something in the feeling of the spaces themselves. Some of them really had a lot of majesty and a kind of timelessness in them. And there's something in icon and symbol that is probably important for us to engage with as well. As perhaps as the kind of artistic side of the response to the meaning crisis kind of gets a bit more, we get a little more painting and music going on with the philosophy and the conversation. Maybe that will involve the kind of generation of new relationships to symbol and new kinds of sort of playful ways of using symbol. I think broadly in Christianity, there's a lot of small things. Sort of prayer at mealtime is a very useful contemplative kind of tool. And, you know, I think there's a lot of value to be found in considering the Christian lineage, considering Christ through the lens of a kind of Christ consciousness, similar way to kind of Buddha nature, Buddhism. And so sort of stepping back from Christian exceptionalism, and then, yeah, I think that there is some real spiritual weight in the symbol that Christ kind of represents, or is kind of the human attempt to give representation to.
Right. So that's some great psychotechnologies, and I think I'm agreeing with all of those and the value of them. So I want to get to the second part of the question: is how do you make those things accessible to a modern person? Because well, we have all of these gems from the past, and they don't seem to be implemented by people. Or people seem to be either dismissing them or struggling to keep up with it, right? And I think that's also due to a lack of being able to relate to the symbolism that's conveyed within those things. So do you have any ideas on that?
I mean, there's a real kind of dilemma with looking at the kind of the rusty sort of psycho-religious technology of Christianity, in terms of the actual church and the building and the attitudes of the people in it, and the way that shows up. Some real issues with trying to, you know, extract, I don't want to say spread, but extract the valuable aspects of that and kind of refertilize them and use them in different ways. I'd say the biggest part of it for me has been taking a sort of intuitive, experimental approach to traditions and practices, in a kind of sincere but playful way, try things out, and don't necessarily feel that you have to imbue them with all of the same significances and meanings that were kind of foisted upon you by whoever shared with you what they meant. Your relationship to, you know, ancient sites of worship or churches be your own, and you can sort of experiment with that, and you can combine a whole range of different activities and things into the texture of your life. So I would say don't be confined to any particular domain, and fill things out and see what works for you, or works, you know, maybe collectively, if it has a positive effect on the people around you. The proof might be in the pudding.
Right. So what I'm hearing there is a fake it till you make it attitude, which is, I think, partially correct necessarily, right? Like we need to develop the connectedness, because if you don't connect, like you cannot develop anything, right? So you need to participate in the experience in order to generate those connections. And then where my mind went is, you described yourself, your atheist phase, right? And I'd imagine that you'd have a different mindset in that space, right? Like that during that time. So do you think those things would be accessible in that phase as well to you, or do you think that you've undergone like a specific change in your life that facilitated this ability to relate like this?
Really great question. No is the answer. I think one of the characteristics of people coming out of Christian contexts and moving into atheist secular contexts that actually carries across is a certain narrow, not necessarily narrow-mindedness, but a narrow breadth of experience. So I wasn't open to those things because my actual cognitive, emotional disposition towards the world was really in reaction towards something. I hadn't integrated my reaction being in opposition to Christianity, and I hadn't really come to understand what I was for or what I was about. And as I mentioned before, my experiences with psychedelics were a really important part of what took me from kind of atheist to atheist plus question mark. And the plus question mark part kind of, has been a steady placeholder ever since. So I've just allowed that space for things that I don't know. And that has kind of trickled in, and I've gradually changed in relationship to it.
So I'm kind of trying to mine you a little bit for information, so my apologies for that. But would you say, because the word that triggered me was reaction, right? You seem to have you had a reactionary relation to the world instead of a relationary, right? And I'm wondering if that's a pattern that you see among the people you were with, right? Like those disillusioned Muslims or whatever atheists you were among.
I think what I saw was a kind of confinement to the political and cultural layers, maybe. The reaction to was kind of an alienation without inquiry. And this is something I've sort of, interestingly, like when Kanye came out with the Jesus is King album, which was his like Christian album that came out this year. One of my friends from school, Harry, you will know who this was. It was Kieran. Showed me the album, and I really liked it. But he kind of communicated to me his own like feeling of like, well, I like the album, but I just want you to know, like, I'm not interested in anything Christian. I found this a few other times with people from my own community who had been to the same like Christian schools or had that sort of post-Christian alienation where it had been like, well, this was the thing that was foisted on us and we didn't like it, and now we're sort of free of it. It hasn't really gone anywhere since.
Hello.
So yeah, thanks for that. That gives me some stuff to think about. So I'll see.
Awesome.
So I just wanted to check in with you on time, Jacob. We've got about an hour. Are you good on time? Did you have a? Did you have a?
I can do the whole 90 minutes,
Okay,
so we'll see.
great.
We'll play it by ear.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to ask you if you could just elaborate a little bit on your discussion with John, where you talked about the landscape of trauma. Sounds like you've done quite a lot of work and thinking on this area. What is the landscape of trauma?
Landscape of trauma is a kind of concept that I arrived at or developed to describe what I felt was a kind of topography or landscape of experience in the world. Is not actually visible to us, but is kind of one of the important sort of landscapes that's defining our action and interaction and the way that we experience the world. So I looked around and saw the really striking occurrence of people finding attraction to partners who had very, very precisely corresponding, familial traumas to their partners without themselves, without having consciously done this. So that's sort of phenomenologically how I began to notice it. As why is it that people who have specific kinds of traumas actually seem to draw those out of the world and continually come into contact with them until the trauma is made conscious and resolved, integrated. So that's kind of the phenomenological aspect. It's also a kind of reconceptualization of the self, and drawing on. I began to draw a lot upon nature and natural patterns over the last several years, and got a really sort of personal relationship with nature. Like nature was kind of has been an integral part of my response to the meaning crisis for myself. It's also begun to inform my sort of thinking. So I began to conceive that selves could actually be understood through sort of branching patterns of trees, sort of root structures. So if you kind of conceive that we have all of these sort of tree roots going back to all of the different experiences we have, and they're sort of larger roots which represent certain trends and themes, and then different aspects of the self. And these sort of root structures were actually all contained within the person that you're calling me, or you, or whoever you're encountering on the street. You just see one person. They actually are constituted of this web of psycho-emotional content and their past experiences and what happened in their childhood and so forth. And so when we're interacting and we're meeting someone, when Harry meets Larry, Harry meets Tracy, and they fall in love, and then they begin to realize that they have all of this commonality in family history. Harry doesn't love Tracy in the same way that her parents didn't love her or something, and so she's kind of attracted to him in order to bring resolution to whatever was in her own past. So it is a kind of hidden landscape of interactions going on between our pasts and the kind of deeper structures of self. It's been a challenge to articulate it because it is hidden, but I found these branching patterns really helpful in beginning to kind of get a sense for what that might feel like. So the landscape of trauma also denotes that within the kind of broader self, we have any branches of the sort of tree of ourself that we're conscious of and that are illuminated. And there are aspects which are not conscious and which are in shadow. So this kind of overlays with the kind of Jordan Peterson, Jungian shadow kind of understanding. So my shadow aspects of the structure of myself kind of interact with the world and interact with partners and intimate relationships and kind of draw out corresponding partners in the world.
And then you and John were also relating individual trauma to societal trauma, and institutional and cultural trauma, and like the effects of World War One and Two, on a community and on the world. How do you interrelate all of this?
Well, all of this I've kind of arrived at through inquiring into my own experience. So a relationship to sort of the collective trauma of the Second World War and First World War is my father's father is in the Second World War and his father in the First World War, and on the other side of the family tree, quite the same. And so sort of understanding the impacts of the trauma of that within my own family, sort of the trauma of experiences of those men and the violence and the sort of fragmentation and sort of violence against the soul, I guess, that occurred at that time for so many people was not actually addressed. Certainly in the context of Britain and the United States in the early 20th century, was no understanding of mental health, had a culture that had come out of Christianity and the Industrial Revolution and so forth. And so I think a lot of these sort of traumas, which all occur individually but are shaped by these collective events, many of them are still acting on us today. And so part of our kind of responsibility to be able to perceive more openly and deeply and act with more agency in response to the meaning crisis is to actually inquire into where these things might be being carried through to the present. Not all of them are so individual. Just to give one example, I got a sense that there was something in my alienation from nature that was just blasted open the first time that I took LSD in a natural context. I felt was not something that had occurred in my lifetime. I felt that the kind of the trauma of relationship to nature and relationship to the natural world and to land was something that had perhaps occurred many centuries before my birth, the Industrial Revolution or even earlier, the development of agriculture. We can kind of go up the stack, past the axial age, past all of these different milestones and identify certain kinds of fragmentation that occurred to humanity collectively. So what I'm really inquiring into is what is that landscape and what are those fragmentations, and how might we begin to notice them, notice the way that we are inframed by them in our lives and in our perception. This is kind of the work of the meaning crisis for me.
So how do we deal with this? Do we all go to psychotherapy? Do we all do some shrooms? What should we each be doing, do you think?
My sense is that psychotherapy institutionally is not really fit to respond to the issue, and that there's something in the format of the therapist-client relationship which is actually part of the issue. This idea of like going to a professional and having your most intimate relationship with someone who is positionally distant from you actually feels like a kind of like part of the emotional violence of the time that we're living in. So the real long-term solution, I think, is that the quality of community and relationship at a kind of self-organizing level is sufficient to regulate that. Like we regulate well-being and spiritual state and emotional state in relationship to the people around us. As for sort of beginning to notice where we might be not noticing and inquire into aspects of ourselves that we don't yet understand, inquire more deeply into experience, I would say that's going to be an individual thing to figure out, but a lot of different paths to it. I think dialogos and this kind of interpersonal inquiry that's popping up in a lot of different communities right now is one of the ways. I think solitary practices, the more kind of Buddhistic meditation paths, and psychedelics should be integrated into the conversation in a way that really respects the power that they have. So I do think that they can be some of our most powerful tools in kind of accessing those boundary dissolving, non-dualistic states, those kinds of flowing states that then when we come back, we can begin to notice all like kind of subtle fragmentations in our lives. Don't all go do shrooms unless you feel really cold and that it's the right time for you.
Great, thanks for that. I think Mark, you've got another question.
Yeah, I really like this this landscape of trauma idea. By the way, I think that's really intriguing, and yeah, I think I'm gonna ask about that instead. Now that I think about it, so sort of what I read into what you were talking about with the landscape of trauma is something like we have these traumatic patterns in our past, and rather than addressing them in a way, we'll say that could resolve the results of them, right? 'Cause you don't necessarily resolve trauma, you sort of grow out of it or grow past it or put it in a relationship to something else so it's a smaller aspect of your life or something, right? Um, but what you seem to be describing is, well, we see this familiar pattern, and as a way of engaging with this pattern, we'll say in a scientific fashion, and I use that word deliberately, as everybody else I'm sure is certain of. We interface with it, right, and try to grapple with it or grasp it or something, um, and especially in the relationship context, right, where my feeling is instead of doing that, we should be being with other people and making connections outside of our experience, we'll say, um, and that will make us bigger, right? That will make us more connected. And so that's something to my mind, like John's short form version of religio is connectedness, right? That would be more religio, but it sounds like your description of this landscape of trauma is more scientifio, if you will. I'm just damaging the language and loving every minute of it because I'm that way, but it just seems like that's more what you're getting at. And then, again, we come back to this thing that I know Manuel made a lot of progress on when you answered his question of what we're calling integration, right? And so, and that's what you're describing, like, oh, the psychedelic experience, and then I was able to integrate. But most people, it doesn't seem are. I've talked with a lot of people about this, and yeah, most people who take drugs and everyone's indicating, well, it depends how and it depends when, and like you're not resolving the problem, right? You're just creating more questions, right? Then the question isn't should you take drugs, but how and when. And so now you have two questions instead of one, right? So but there does seem to be a relationship between this interaction with the world, we'll say the religio way, the connected way, and the scientifico way, the scientific way of relating to things. And so I know I'm probably like right at the edge of your thinking, and I'm way past my own. So I'm out in front of you, way more lost. Um, what do you think about that conception of these sort of two aspects of the world? One where we're confronting, and the other where we're connecting and relating or participating or something, as a way to sort of maybe explain your landscape of trauma and tie it, more concretely to the meaning crisis. So and I'll let you riff on that, because there's no real like solid question in there.
Like the way you're digging deeper on this, Mark. So I guess so at the beginning you kind of talked about a kind of grasping at understanding the nature of the trauma or the landscape of trauma. I would stress that my sort of reception of this notion and the way that it's taken form has been entirely intuitive. So any attempt for me to kind of pose a frame or accelerate the process, or it's very much tied up with my own healing process. And those processes are ones which take time and patience. And yeah, I would say that these things have come in an intuitive fashion. So what I found is that, whatever reason, the way that my sort of pattern making capacity interacted with sort of opening up to the possibility of these things is what allowed it to come through. To put it in another way, the articulation in language of what was the emotional dynamic with my parents or my grandparents, or how had the thing sort of been transmitted. The conceptual understanding was only arrived at on the other side of experiencing what it was. And so I had to take a kind of not knowing, intuitive relationship to the world in general. And as you spoke about connection, I think kind of having at least one relationship, hopefully more, but starting with your partner, I guess, or your close friends, family, relationship where you're kind of affording the possibility of something that you don't know about yourself coming up. It's not necessarily like, oh, you have to be open to somebody telling you something about yourself. It's more, when a conflict is recurring or arising, or something like this seems to be playing out, or there's a dynamic that you begin to notice, just sort of trying to take a inquiring, same kind of philosophical inquiring relationship to that, and kind of exploring in this like circling way that Guy Sengstock has developed, like speaking into what's coming as it's coming. And so this is kind of the way in which understanding of it has come out. I think imbue it with scientifico, whatever you called it. And that's where I've come from, in a way. Like, disposition has very strongly come from a background of being like rational, analytical mind and understanding, and then moved more into an intuitive and sort of not knowing and ambiguous state. So I am trying to synthesize those in my own sort of unique way. And I think that part of kind of stepping through the sort of eye of the needle that we seem to be facing right now, collectively, is involve a little bit of playfulness and looseness, with the kind of dialectical balancing between the sort of rational scrutiny and the intuitive, not knowing, embodied, like the body mind side of things. So what you're kind of pointing to is very, very important, because I think the like rational scientifico religio thing is, it's the same kind of tension that you can see with like the mind body dualism, and Zach Stein has his own models about ensoulment and transcendence and self-authoring, and have all these different linguistic names around it.
Yeah, that's interesting. The only thing I wanted to comment on, because you brought it up, is this idea of what you are in relation to a problem, right, versus what you are in relation to the world around you. And for me, what that brought up, and we have pages and pages of notes on trying to work all this stuff out, right? What that brought up for me is participation. And then I immediately went to, well, and this is an open question, because I'm way not smart enough to understand this. Can you actually participate with yourself, right? So as the world brings you more into yourself and allows you to be more by yourself, we'll say, and not notice all the things you rely on, right? Like nobody notices, to Jordan Peterson's point, how many people are working on the power lines to make sure you have electricity, and then nobody notices how many things require electricity. Like what your life would be like without electricity is pretty significant, right? I mean, it really causes people a lot of panic. We haven't seen that in a while, right? The tower did go out in like large swaths of Canada and New York City for quite a long time once, but and that's happened before. It happened in California with rolling blackouts and things, but we don't have that appreciation. And so I'm wondering if this is what that you're really putting your finger on this whole idea of what am I in relation to a problem versus what am I in relation to everything, and then that's wrapped up in the participation. And for our models purposes, for the stuff we've been talking about here, this idea of the participation and getting that it's more an intuitive sense of, we'll call them the invariant patterns of the world, um, and learning to navigate that is really what's important, right? Because navigating the participation through the patterns is really what gives you the connectedness, we'll say, and that's what provides sort of the meaning. And the place you're looking for the meaning that's broken is this relationship between yourself and the problem, right? Because the problem isn't a real thing, right? It's either a projection or it's a small part of a larger picture, right? And so in that way, it's not a discrete thing that you can resolve. So I don't know what you of any of that, but that's what popped up when you were talking.
Yeah. And I'll throw it over to Brett after this, but I feel that we really need to experience our thinking, and in some sense organize our thinking in a way that it is fluidly moving from our personal experience to the meta context and the various kind of meta models and conceptual frameworks. And I think working in a kind of boundary dissolving space and in a space of not knowing is kind of essential to moving in that direction. I forgot the second thing I was going to say, so I'll leave it at that. But thank you, Mike.
So I'd like to squeeze one last question in. So you talked about, being in, say, a church and looking at the aesthetics of the church and feeling like you're on the cusp of getting something, but not quite getting it, but then going out into the street and finding the real deal. And you said that that you're getting more walking down the street and observing day to day life than inside the church. Can can you just expand on what you mean by that, and what is the real deal, and how do you get that to be so in touch with what's around you in that way?
It's beautiful, and very enormous as an inquiry. Uh, yeah, I mean that was actually the direct account of a day that I had, and I guess I've had many days like it, but a particular day that I was out in Greece, and just sensing into the experience in that church, and then um, the ornamentation and the structure of the church itself has this kind of golden railing, and behind the golden railing is kind of a sort of large door with a kind of short, beautiful, decorated, ornamented wall, and behind that is another altar, and so forth. I was alluding to this way in which the magic, um, the access to God, in the pre-modern way of talking about it, the access to God is sort of always foisted away just behind the curtain, or into the um, person of the preacher or the institution, or even into the text itself. Like the text becomes the glorified symbolic channel for access to the divine. So I guess what I'm talking about is experiencing the world as deeply as our bodies and being can afford us, which has a lot of richness to it. But but the possibility of experiencing that is being constrained and held back by many, many layers of disaffection and disassociation. Even just very modern life of smartphones and digital technology, and the sort of level of simulation it seems we experience when we're walking around these kinds of man-made virtual environments, do get cut off. And so getting back to quiet places, getting immersed fully into nature is kind of where it's at for me. Music and friends and cannabis and all kinds of different things can be catalysts of dropping in more fully. What happens when we drop in more fully? If we work in some really intense sort of corporate desk job that keeps us busy all the time, that we don't even have the chance to reflect on whether it's meaningful to us or what we actually wanted to do. When people step out of those contexts, of the context of the city, and they go into the forest, and just fully immersed in nature, and very often the first thing they're going to experience is a lot of like noise and like unease. Like you don't kind of get straight to harmonious sort of relationship with nature straight away. You go in there with all of the noise of your life and all those emotions that are not being processed. Something about being in the natural context, or being in sort of certain spaces of inquiry with other people kind of open it up, and we can drop into like this, also like at a music event or something of that kind. Something that affords you to drop in deeply and really see where you're at in your life. Psychedelic experience as well. But when we do drop in, there's work to be done, and sometimes we're going to realize that there's a lot of disassociation and lack of creative vision and lack of empathy, low-level toxicities all around us in our lives. And so what Mark was saying about sort of cleaning up your room versus the meta crisis, everything's interrelated, and so it's not one specific problem, but it's the way of approaching. I think those we can hold those in dialectic, and we can say, like, if it's actually that you are drinking alcohol excessively, then that is the bedroom that needs to be cleaned up. And that is, that's like the pressing work that needs to be confronted in order to get at, what is it that is driving it? What's causing the desire to disassociate from life and that kind of thing. So there's a kind of fluidity, I guess, between the meta meaning crisis circumstance and the smaller aspects of our life. So, confronting the things that are uncomfortable for us to confront, and trying to create beauty and meaning and connection in all of these small different ways is cumulatively changing us and changing the way that we're constituted by every aspect of our lives. And that then will afford a different relationship to meta crisis, meaning crisis, and hopefully we won't be stuck talking about ourselves in crisis. Maybe that will be part of what allows us to sort of bridge over to the other side, getting to a state where it's like, okay, it's okay. Even if it's really, really bad, we can be okay here, and we can sort of sit in a circle and find some solace and a little more clarity, and go from there.
Well, what a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Jacob, for being here. This has been truly enjoyable conversation, and I hear you're going to be speaking with John again, so maybe we can have you back after your next Voices with Viveki.
It's been really good, Brett, and I'd love to do that. If anybody wants to hear more, just jump on SenseSpace YouTube. It's one word. And I'll have more conversations and guided meditations and things coming soon. So,
that's great. And
thank you all. Yeah. By the way, thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone in the audience.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the great questions. Thank you everyone for being here. Those, if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And again, this was great. And we look forward to chatting again. And you're welcome to hang out in the forum anytime you'd like. So, please join us. I know you've been on a little bit. So, we'd love to have you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett.
All right.
Thank you, Jacob. Really appreciate it. Come anytime and talk to us while we're here, because we're here a lot, unfortunately, sometimes.
So yeah, great. I'll try and drop in when there's a good slot.
Sounds great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.